quite often when we listen to the gospel passage that's presented to us at Mass, we see it in isolation, or listen to it in isolation from its context within the gospel itself. And this is one of those examples when we really do well to consider its position in the gospel. It follows on from last Sunday's gospel directly, which was, remember, about Peter's confession of faith, saying that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. That followed on from the rejection of Jesus by the Pharisees. So this is chapter 16 in Matthew's Gospel, part of his fourth book, which is the book on the church, when he deals with how the church is to exist, the very early church. So we have, starts off with rejection of Jesus, then an identification of Jesus as the Son of Man, and then into this passage. The little bit that's missed out, just a sort of link word, is from that point, at that time on, which Matthew uses a few times to say something, there's a change in direction. And here, then, Jesus makes it clear to his disciples he's about to suffer. Well, Peter had just said, well, you're the Messiah, and he had the sort of current opinion of the time that the Messiah would come and would bring political liberation, freedom from the Roman rule, and perhaps also a liberation from the corrupt maybe priests in the temple and so on. So that was the kind of idea that he was getting when he said, yes, you're the Christ, the Messiah. And then Jesus turns around and says, no, this is not to be. My mission is to die for you. That's one aspect, really, of irony that we see in this passage, that Jesus turns everything on its head. So we have to start with, the mission of the Messiah is in fact to suffer and to die, as prophesied by Isaiah and the suffering servant and many other passages as well, that Jesus was going to be a Messiah who was going to die for his people. Then Peter takes him aside, so the expression there is a bit like sort of putting his arm round him and sort of taking him off to the side and saying, look, Lord, this is not to happen to you. What's the expression it says in here? It says, heaven preserve you, Lord. Well, another way of translating that would be, God forbid, that can't happen to you. And the expression in Greek is simply helios soi, which means mercifully to you. So, merciful Lord, no, that's not happened to you. Certainly not, that's not going to happen to me, and things like that, is an expression that we find quite a bit in the Greek version of the Old Testament. But there's a little bit of an irony in it when we stop and think about it, because the word, he says, is merciful. Merciful Lord. And yet it's precisely in the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus that he's just foretold that we find the mercy of God. So there's an ironic twist to Peter's words. He says, merciful God, this is certainly not going to happen to you. And it's exactly how God's mercy is going to be shown through the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And then Jesus turns to Peter and says, what sounds like terrible words, don't they? Get behind me, Satan. Well, Satan, for us, we tend to think of Satan meaning the evil one. In fact, there's a different word for the evil one, hoponeros. But Satan is a word that was last on Jesus' lips right back in chapter 4 with the temptations of Jesus before he started his ministry. And he said to the devil, go, Satan. He didn't say get behind me, but go. And the words to Peter are very, very similar, except that he says, go, get behind me, Satan. Satan means the tempter, hence why Jesus called him Satan at his own temptation. He was tempting him to go off and take a different course of being a hero and everybody would see him and so on. And Peter, unwittingly, is doing the same kind of thing. He's presenting a temptation to Jesus, and Jesus recognizes that as a temptation, didn't he, in the agony in the garden. Take this chalice from me, but not your will, but not my will, but your will be done. It was a very real temptation not to be crucified. And Jesus was trying to tempt him in that way as well. But Jesus, in saying, Satan, get behind me, or pisomu in the Greek, is actually the word that he uses to anybody who follows him. So he's not saying, go away, never come back to me. He's saying, take your place behind me and follow me. And of course, eventually Peter did get behind him literally and was crucified eventually many years later. So get behind me, Satan. Behind me is a very important word that Jesus uses there. And he says, you're an obstacle in my path. Literally, the word is a scandal. Well, here's another point of irony. Remember, the immediate bit from last Sunday's gospel was that Jesus had proclaimed Peter to be the rock on what he's going to build his church. And when you trip up, if you're in the desert, what do you trip up over? A rock. So Peter, from being in the last passage, the rock, the foundation of the church, has now become the rock on which Jesus is going to stumble. So there's an irony in this passage when you compare the two passages. So I'm going to trip up over you. If you push me this way, this is my first announcement that I'm going to have to die. And putting your arm around, taking me away, says, this is not going to happen to you, Lord, is a temptation that I don't want to hear. It's going to trip me up. Because the way you think is not God's way, but man's way. That, again, echoes last Sunday's gospel. And do you remember when Jesus said to Peter, you're blessed, Simon, son of Jonah, because it's not flesh and blood, i.e. human reason, that's revealed this to you, that he's the Messiah, but my Father in heaven. So it's not flesh and blood that has revealed you that I am the Messiah, but now it's saying, Jesus is saying, now you're thinking like a man, now you're thinking like flesh and blood, because you haven't recognized that Messiahship for me, for Jesus, means to suffer and die and rise again on the third day. So, looking at the two passages together, we see this wonderful interplay between the two, an ironic interplay. And then Jesus goes on to announce the cost of discipleship. Being the Messiah means he's going to suffer and die, but being a disciple of Jesus also means that we must pick up our cross, renouncing ourselves, and follow him. And in fact, some Christians have even had to die for their faith as well. And renouncing ourselves, obviously we think about renouncing ourselves, doing a bit of Friday penance and doing some penance in Lent. Well, really the whole focus of this, renouncing self, is making the guiding principle of our life not simply me, but God. And saying, well, how does God direct my life? And in that sense, we're renouncing ourselves. So it doesn't mean to say we have to give up every penny that we've got, but it's putting every penny that we have, or everything else that's in our life, at the service of God, and trying to determine where he is leading us. And in that way, then, Jesus says you'll have real life, a life that's much further beyond, if you like, the ordinary humdrum life of our world that's offered to us by our world. So this is true life, is to put everything within our life at the feet of God and say everything is directed by him. And then we have those scary words, don't we? Right at the end of this passage, at the end of chapter 16, when the Son of Man comes, he will reward each one according to his behavior. No, not simply about saying, Lord, Lord, my faith, but praxis, but what we do. So we show that we have subordinated the whole of our life, renouncing ourselves, as it were, by putting God first, by the way we behave. Now, there's a sort of from this Sunday to next Sunday. I can't remember what it's called now, ... It's called something anyway. That's chapter 17. So the whole of chapter 17 is missed out between this Sunday and next Sunday. So guess what? I'm going to recommend that you read chapter 17 this week. And it's really important because we start off with the Transfiguration. So there's a logical development about this passage. We've got Jesus is proclaimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God, by Peter, who becomes the foundation rock of the church. Then he warns them that he's going to suffer and die. That's the cost of Messiahship. And then he reveals himself in his glory to Peter and James and John on the mountain. This is omitted because we have it in Lent and also on the Feast of the Transfiguration in August, beginning of early August, 6th of August. So, and then there are a few other pieces, like there's a healing and so on, and the other prophecies of the Passion, and finishes off with a temple tax. And then we go into the second part of this fourth book, which is the discourse, Jesus teaching his disciples what it really means to have leadership in his church.